What is at stake when we talk about the future? Or to put it differently, what is at stake when we talk about futures, in plural? Whether these are futures that have been created in the past, past futures, whether these are futures that are being created as we speak, or whether these are futures that are yet to be created. In this particular segment, I want to focus on the interrelations between multiple temporalities on the one hand and world-building imaginaries on the other as a problem in what are called future histories. Future history may be called a specific subgenre of science fiction that describes what H.G. Wells called the shape of things to come. Because the future is not really a knowable domain in the entirety of its conception. Loose details may be predicted. For instance, the sun will probably still exist as an entity in the sky tomorrow. One would probably get up and brush their teeth and so forth. But the futures that concern us have a different texture because they are permeated by unknowability. What would be the future of humanity when we are faced with the specter of climate change and global warming? Would anyone have a job in 20 years with advances in robotics? Would my country still exist in 5 years, or will borders be redrawn? It is possible for one to go to bed in one country and wake up in another without physically moving. Future histories imagine what it would be like to inhabit possible futures. 3 frames govern the nature of future histories. The first frame is extrapolation. Now, extrapolation in future histories requires that the present is extensible into the future in some fashion. Basic extrapolation is rather easy to understand. It depends on drawing a causal relation between what exists and what may come to exist. So often we hear people talk about how science fiction predicts things, but that is easy, we all do it. We can imagine extrapolated technology, for instance. It is possible to imagine humanoid robots at this moment. Just imagine a mannequin with some intelligence and freedom of movement. But technological extrapolation is different from epistemological extrapolation, or how knowledge itself and ways of knowing might evolve. To reach a state where these humanoid robots are actually capable of human-like behavior, the moment they dip into what is known as uncanny valley requires, even at the moment, extraordinary leaps in scientific development. The imaginary of technological extrapolation is always out of sync with possibility because epistemological extrapolation is harder to comprehend. Extrapolation is always bound to the temporal consistency of W0, or the world as it exists, and we will return to this problem. The second frame is that of the thought experiment, or the what if, identified by Ursula K. Le Guin as central to science fiction and her work. Instead of dealing with the extension of the known, we insert an element that changes how we perceive the known. Alternate histories, or allohistories, for instance, are a good example. In science fiction, we often speak about the John Bar point or John Bar hinge, where history is split. So one changes a small element in history and all of subsequent history becomes different. What if Hitler won the war? What if the British never colonized India? What if the Chinese colonized America before Europe? But what ifs can also have another texture, which are not about the past, but about the future. What if humans really discover time travel? What if humans discover how to travel vast interstellar distances faster than the speed of light? What if humans became a multiplanetary species? What ifs are not bound by the temporal consistency of W0, or world as it exists. They can begin from an imagined change to the consequence of that change. The third frame is that of possible and impossible worlds. Extrapolations and what ifs require a consistency in world building but may differ in their temporal consistency. They are thus bound by the notion of possible worlds in the fictional realm, which we can call W1. For an example of possibility, say it is not possible to have a logically consistent human world where A is the mother of B and B is the mother of A, are together possible. However, it is possible for a future historical narrative to consciously conflict with the notion of possibility, a world in which two things apparently contradictory can coexist, a world we may call W2. Narratives that posit dream logic do not need to make sense. It's all down the rabbit hole. Philip K. Dick's Ubik or Christopher Priest's affirmation are fine examples of the porous boundaries between the possible and the impossible. But isn't all future history, given the fundamental unknowability of the future, a narrative of an impossible world? Are all future histories not inherently dream logic? And here one comes to the heart of the problem of future histories and multiple temporalities, is that future history is, at its heart, an impossibility. But it is also this impossibility that is its most generative ability, and what makes future histories, and for that matter science fiction, so important. But to understand that, we need to see each work of future history as simultaneously the activation of these multiple frames that expand the range of possible worlds. Future histories had been written since the Enlightenment, starting with Volney's Ruins from 1791, unless one counts theological histories and mythological sagas in all traditions, many of which do have the future as horizon, such as the end of the Kali Yuga or the apocalypse or the Ragnarok or similar concepts. Future histories differ from mythologicals in their separation of the end of time and the world as closure to an open, extensible time as a modifiable future of the world. The trajectories evolved therein were continuities or extensions of tendencies in the present, sometimes as prophecy, sometimes as warning, sometimes as wish fulfillment. In the early 19th century, when two pioneering future histories were written in India by Kailash Chandra Dutt and Shashi Chandra Dutt, the future had become a zone which expressed possible worlds set a century ahead in time, which would bring about a country, India, free from British rule. The French were masters of the future history. The works of Jules Verne or Albert Robida, all of these, they produced numerous histories set in possible worlds, extrapolating from the present. Albert Robida's 20th century, for instance. All of this was accompanied by a deepening of temporalities, where human temporality became one amongst many rhythms of time. For instance, geological time had another rhythm, which separated human history from other planetary histories. Evolutionary time had another, species rhythm, that intersected with, but which was not only human determined. What future histories focused on primarily was the separation of these unknowable variants, to a certain extent to deepened focus on social evolution of humankind. If these alternative rhythms could not perfectly be attuned to each other, it was the social rhythm that could be synchronized, be it through colonial impositions of economic and cultural violence, the introduction of technological means to control the social order, and so on. Now, the social order appeared much more controllable with future historical extrapolations, which were the unfolding of world building into possible human societies. When in 1895 H.G. Wells produced his landmark work, The Time Machine, the generic horizon of the future history was altered, because here was an attempt to merge more temporalities than previously. The extrapolation of human society and its problems in Wells's own time into 802-701 AD, the extrapolation of human evolution in terms of future speciation rendered through a technological tool that didn't exist, marking out the conceptual development of a new epistemological framework of time as a fourth dimension in the process, while culminating in a cosmological evolution explored in the extinction of the solar system and planet Earth. Wells's novel clearly activates the extrapolatory of the social and the what if, or the novum of The Time Machine. Wells's greatest follower in England, Olaf Stapledon, wrote the quintessential future histories in 1930s, Last and First Men, which had a human time scale, and Star Maker, which had a cosmic universal time scale, vast time scales of billions of years. Robert Heinlein in the US developed his own future historical timeline, and others such as Isaac Asimov and Cordwainer Smith produced further elaborations. Each of these future histories retains some common possibilities, such as the development of space travel, extraplanetary colonization. All of these synchronized the planets and ideas and technologies of their time. Alongside each of these visions in future history, however, the future also kept consistently changing and altering. What made sense as future in Olaf Stapledon's era no longer made sense in another. The ponderous technologies of early science fiction no longer made sense, and developments that were completely unanticipated cropped up all the time. Thus, future histories themselves became a mutable field of semantic framing. In Asimov's fiction, psychohistory became the central connecting thread guiding the final development of the all-human galaxy, albeit through robotic intervention. In Asimov's future history universe until the 80s, psychohistory was the dominant paradigm. Now, psychohistory is a curiously paradoxical science. It performs both functions of knowing what may come to pass, which makes the future appear determined but discoverable, and of determining what may come to pass, which makes the future open because it can be regulated into infinity. This seemed perfectly fair from the statistical perspective of the early Asimov, but by the 70s and 80s, when Asimov returned to his universe in the final books of the Foundation series, their statistical approach seemed altogether too simple when complexity science had exploded across the sciences and the arts. Psychohistory was no longer even feasible. To render the future knowable, once again, he had to turn to the Gaia hypothesis and imagine a planet in which all different minds were connected to give shape to the future of humanity as a whole, in which the entire galaxy could be connected as one group mind. Rather than thinking of the future of humanity as something that is guided by a secret cabal of psychohistorians being the hidden hand of future history, right? And yet, perhaps because the future is fundamentally unknowable, we feel the urge to consistently know about it. I should repeat that probably. And yet, perhaps because the future is fundamentally unknowable, we feel the urge to consistently know about it. What future histories address is a need to frame the knowable unknown alongside the unknowable unknown in order to expand the range of possibles. By that, one means that because the trajectories of the future in its fullness is impossible to know, the form of fiction allows possibles to be placed alongside probables, but just as importantly, within the science fictional form of future history, allows the placement of impossibles in the domain of the possible. To study this in another form, we may invoke a short story by James Thurber, the American humorist, and call it the unicorn in the garden problem. In the short story, Unicorn in the Garden, there is a husband who sees a unicorn in the garden, and he goes out and he feeds it. Coming back indoors, he wakes up his wife to tell her about the unicorn. The wife, who is bitter at him, tells him that she would send him to a madhouse if he spoke about mythical beasts. The husband looks out the door to the garden and says, well, the unicorn is still there and has a horn. And then he goes out to the garden again. The wife calls the police and the psychiatrist the moment he steps out and says, help, my husband has gone mad because he's seeing unicorns. And they come and they tie her up instead. When the husband comes back in, they ask him, did you tell your wife you saw a unicorn? And he says, of course not. The unicorn is a mythical beast. So they take her away as she seems to have gone mad. Now, the disturbing humor in this particular story relies on an expansion in the range of possibles that circumscribe reality. Now, unicorns here are the binary value that determines what is real and what is not. They either exist or they do not. In W0, the real world, unicorns do not exist, while in W1, the framework of fiction, they exist. It is, however, in W2 that the two collide and give rise to a new possibility altogether. Unicorns both exist and do not exist at the same time. Now, the moment we begin to perceive reality as this fluid relation between possibles and impossible, we move beyond the binaries and, like Schrodinger's apocryphal cat, still in the box but now in many dimensions, experience reality as made up of multiple possible worlds. What happens in the succession of future histories is that the future consistently overtakes what we may consider to be a future. What we may consider known, knowable, and unknown keeps shifting in relation to each other. As newer temporalities open up in new epistemological frames, newer strategies of synchronization along with newer possible worlds emerge in narrative to account for the collapse of the previous temporalities as well as to incorporate newer ones. A ball dropped on planet Earth and a ball dropped in zero gravity alters the range of the possible, just as human history seen from a bordered perspective of nation states is altered by deepening the timeline of human migration. Following the trajectory of even the humble potato across continents alters perspectives on entire national cuisines. To return to a previous problem, A as the mother of B may coexist with B being the mother of A depending on the semantic range of motherhood, once extended into organisms that reproduce by binary fission like the amoeba. To enter the quantum realm is to enter another degree of impossibilities and probabilities altogether. Each thread of temporality that is opened up by a new epistemology or way of knowing constitutes, at its inception, a certain trajectory of possibles. But each layer of epistemology invades this trajectory of possibles with other conflicting possibles. In contemporary times, one of the determining trajectories of possible futures is that which is opened up by the specter of planetary boundaries and climate change. Yet to work with climate change and the possibilities of climate disaster is to think outside linearities of inevitability to invoke multiple possibilities of action. Invoke multiple possible presents that may lead to multiple possible futures. To ensure there is a future at all, we must have multiple presents. This is where future histories and science fiction come in and challenge the possibles. If the world isn't changeable, if its possibilities are already written and inevitable, then there is no necessity of action, because no action has any real consequence. It is because it isn't inevitable that we still act, think in possibles, think in multiples, think in futures. We live in the coexistence of contradictory multiple possibles, because it is in the impossible and the non-logical, buried in its heart, where the ultimate seductive power of the future resides.